The scent of copper, ruptured asphalt, and freezing rain filled the crushed interior of the Maybach. Trapped in the jagged wreckage, a billionaire CEO's breaths grew dangerously shallow. Pulling her bleeding form against his chest, a struggling single father leaned down and whispered into the siren's wail, "Please don't. You're the one I've loved all along." The boardroom of Sterling Global sat on the 52nd floor of the Seattle skyline, encased in floor-to-ceiling glass that made the world below look like a miniature, insignificant model. Victoria Sterling preferred it that way. At 38, she was the sole heir and CEO of a logistics and real estate empire worth an estimated $4 billion. She was known in the financial press as the Ice Queen of the Pacific Northwest, a woman who dismantled rival corporations with the same emotionless precision she used to order her morning espresso. But the man sitting across the mahogany table from her today was not a rival CEO. He was a ghost from a life she had tried desperately to bury. Arthur Davies looked out of place among the Italian leather chairs and sleek marble accents. He wore a faded canvas jacket over a flannel shirt, his work boots leaving faint traces of drywall dust on the pristine carpeting. At 40, life had carved deep lines around his eyes. He was the owner of Davies Contracting, a modest, mid-sized construction firm that had miraculously won a subcontractor bid for Victoria's new flagship warehouse facility. He was also a single father to a 7-year-old girl named Chloe, having lost his wife to a sudden illness 3 years prior. And 20 years ago, he had been the center of Victoria Sterling's universe. "You're in breach of contract, Mr. Davies," Victoria said, her voice a cool, measured alto that echoed slightly in the massive room. She didn't look at him, keeping her eyes fixed on the tablet in front of her. "Your firm is 3 weeks behind schedule on the foundational pause. The penalty clause is clear. $5 million, payable immediately, or Sterling Global will absorb your company's assets to cover our losses." Arthur shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening. He looked at the woman he had once known so intimately. Gone was the bright-eyed, rebellious college student who used to sneak out of her father's Hamptons estate to eat cheap diner food with him. In her place sat a hardened monarch in a tailored charcoal suit, her dark hair pulled back into a severe, unforgiving twist. "Victoria Ms. Sterling," Arthur corrected himself, keeping his voice steady despite the tremor of panic in his chest. "I sent you the geological reports. The soil on the eastern quadrant of the site is unstable. It's a subterranean washout that wasn't on the original city surveys. If we pour the foundation now, the eastern load-bearing walls will sink within a decade. I paused the pour to save the integrity of your building." "You paused the pour." Victoria finally looked up, her gaze piercing. "Without my authorization. You don't make executive decisions for Sterling Global, Arthur. You pour concrete." The harshness of her words stung, but Arthur refused to look away. "I'm trying to save your project, and I'm trying to save my business. If you trigger that penalty clause, I'm bankrupt. I have a crew of 50 men with families. I have a daughter. I can't lose this company." Victoria felt a sudden, unwelcome tightening in her chest at the mention of his daughter. She expertly pushed the emotion down, locking it away behind years of practiced apathy. 20 years ago, Arthur Davies had been a scholarship student at Cornell, brilliant and full of idealistic fire. They had been inseparable. They had talked about running away to Europe, about building a life far away from the suffocating grip of her father, Richard Sterling. But when the time came, Arthur had vanished. He had abandoned her, leaving behind only a brief, typed letter saying the pressure of her world was too much for him. A year later, she heard he had married someone else. She had learned then that love was a liability. She hadn't let anyone in since. Business is ruthless, Mr. Davies. A lesson you should have learned by now, Victoria said, standing up to signal the end of the meeting. Arthur stood up as well, his imposing frame casting a long shadow across the boardroom table. You haven't changed, Victoria. You still look at the world from behind glass, terrified to actually touch it. I'm not leaving until you come to the site. Come to the site, look at the washout yourself. If you still want to pour the concrete and ruin the building, fine, you can ruin me too. But you're going to look me in the eye while you do it. Victoria bristled. Her head of security took a step forward, but she raised a single manicured hand to stop him. She looked at Arthur. He was desperate, exhausted, yet fiercely protective of his work and his people. A tiny fragment of the girl she used to be admired him for it. Fine, Victoria snapped, grabbing her trench coat from the chair. Thomas has the car waiting downstairs. You have 20 minutes to convince me not to destroy your life, Arthur. Let's go. The skies over Seattle had opened up, unleashing a torrential downpour that turned the afternoon sky the color of bruised iron. Victoria's armored Maybach glided smoothly through the slick streets, the thick glass completely isolating them from the roar of the traffic and the pelting rain outside. In the spacious back seat, the physical distance between Victoria and Arthur was only a few feet, but the emotional chasm was a bottomless void. Thomas, Victoria's longtime driver, kept his eyes strictly on the road, knowing better than to listen in on his boss's tense silence. You look tired, Arthur, Victoria said suddenly, the silence finally grating on her nerves. She didn't mean for it to sound compassionate. She aimed for an observation, cold and clinical. Being a single parent and running a business doesn't leave much time for sleep, Arthur replied, looking out the window at the blurred city lights. He turned his head slightly to look at her. Is it worth it? The empire? The empty boardroom? Are you happy, Victoria? The question felt like a physical blow. I am successful, she replied sharply. I control my destiny. That's better than happiness. It's certainly better than poverty, and it's infinitely better than relying on a man who takes a payoff to disappear when things get difficult. Arthur's brow furrowed in genuine confusion. He leaned forward. A payoff? What the hell are you talking about? Victoria let out a bitter laugh. Don't insult my intelligence, Arthur. We're well past the statute of limitations on your betrayal. My father told me everything. He showed me the ledger. $100,000 wired to your student account the day before you wrote that pathetic goodbye letter. You sold me, Arthur. You sold our future to start your little contracting business. Arthur's face went pale. The air in the car seemed to evaporate. Victoria, I never took a dime from your father. Richard came to my dorm. He told me you had accepted a proposal from William Harper. He showed me the engagement announcement in the Times, drafted and ready for print. He said if I loved you, I wouldn't drag you into my world of debt and dirt. I left because I thought you had chosen William. I left because I wanted you to have the world. Victoria stared at him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. William Harper. Her father had tried to force that marriage for years, but she had fought it bitterly, eventually cutting ties with William entirely. Her father had lied to Arthur, and he had lied to her. $100,000. It was a phantom transaction, a manipulated ledger designed to break her heart so she would fall in line. 20 years. 20 years of anger, of building a fortress around her heart, all founded on a lie, spun by a man who had been dead for a decade. Arthur, Victoria began, her voice trembling, the Ice Queen facade cracking and shattering into a million pieces. She never finished the sentence. At the intersection of 4th and Pike, a massive, fully loaded freight truck lost its brakes on the rain-slicked steep grade. It ran the red light at 60 miles per hour. The impact was apocalyptic. The truck T-boned the Maybach directly on the passenger side. The world dissolved into a deafening symphony of tearing metal, exploding glass, and violent, uncontrollable motion. The heavy luxury car was lifted off the ground, spinning like a discarded toy before slamming violently into a concrete traffic pillar. Then there was only the hissing of the engine and the relentless drumming of the rain. Arthur regained consciousness with the taste of copper flooding his mouth. His vision swam. The car was on its side, the roof caved in. The smell of gasoline and deployed airbags was suffocating. He blinked rapidly, ignoring the agonizing pain in his left shoulder. "Victoria," he gasped, his voice a hoarse rasp. He unbuckled his seatbelt and dropped awkwardly to the interior wall of the overturned car. Thomas, the driver, was slumped against the steering wheel, completely unresponsive. Arthur crawled through the debris of the back seat. He found her pinned. The reinforced door had buckled inward, trapping Victoria from the waist down. The side window had shattered, and the freezing rain was pouring in over her. Her face was pale, a stark contrast to the dark crimson pooling beneath her head. "Victoria!" Hey, look at me!" Arthur panicked, tearing off his flannel shirt and pressing it desperately against the severe laceration on her temple. Her eyelids fluttered. She looked up at him, her gaze unfocused. "Arthur, it hurts. I can't feel my legs." "Don't move. The ambulance is coming. I can hear the sirens," he lied, though the wail of emergency vehicles was just beginning to cut through the ambient noise of the storm. He gripped her hand. Her skin was terrifyingly cold. "It was a lie," she whispered, her breathing ragged and shallow. Blood trickled from the corner of her mouth. "My father. He stole our lives, Arthur." "Shh! Don't talk. Save your strength." Tears finally broke through Arthur's eyes, mixing with the dirt and blood on his face. He pulled her upper body against his chest, shielding her from the rain coming through the broken window. "I was so angry," she choked out, her grip on his hand tightening with surprising, desperate strength. "I became him. I became my father. I'm sorry, Arthur. I'm so sorry I was cruel to you today." "Stop it, Victoria. You're going to be fine. We're going to get you out of here," Arthur sobbed, the tough, weathered contractor completely breaking down as the woman he had never truly stopped loving faded in his arms. "Take care of your little girl," Victoria whispered, her eyes drifting shut. "Take care of Chloe." Arthur pulled her bleeding form tighter against his chest, burying his face in her dark hair. He didn't care about the sirens, the rain, or the gasoline. He only cared about the heartbeat fluttering weakly against his own. "Please don't," he wept, pressing his lips to her forehead. "Please don't leave me again. You're the one I've loved all along." Victoria's eyes snapped open one last time, a sudden, startling clarity piercing through her pain. She gripped his torn collar, pulling him down to her lips. "Arthur," she gasped, her voice barely a thread. "Before I die, you need to know. The private investigator I hired when you came back to town. I saw Chloe's medical files, her blood type, the rare autoimmune marker." Arthur froze, his heart stopping in his chest. "Victoria, what are you saying?" "Sarah wasn't her biological mother, Arthur," Victoria wheezed, her eyes rolling back as the darkness finally claimed her. "Chloe is—" Her hand fell limp from his collar. The harsh, fluorescent lighting of Harborview Medical Center offered no warmth, only a sterile illumination that seemed to drain the color from everything it touched. Arthur sat on a rigid plastic chair in the surgical waiting unit, his head in his hands. His left arm was immobilized in a thick canvas sling, a fractured collarbone throbbing in time with his elevated pulse. A jagged line of black stitches traced his jawline, a brutal souvenir from the shattered window of the Maybach. But the physical pain was a distant, muted hum compared to the agonizing, psychological static consuming his mind. Sarah wasn't her biological mother. Chloe is... The words looped relentlessly in his consciousness, a haunting echo of Victoria's fading voice in the wreckage. Outside the reinforced windows, the Seattle storm raged on, thrashing the city with violent gusts of wind and freezing rain, mirroring the absolute chaos tearing through Arthur's reality. Down the hall, the heavy double doors of the operating theatre swung open. Dr. Aris Harrison, a neurosurgeon with exhausted eyes and a blood-speckled paper mask pulled down around his neck, approached. Arthur stood instantly, his knees protesting the sudden movement. "Mr. Davies?" Dr. Harrison spoke in a low, measured tone designed to mitigate panic. "Victoria survived the surgery. We managed to relieve the epidural hematoma, the bleeding in her brain. The crushing injury to her lower extremities was severe, causing significant spinal shock. She is in a medically induced coma to allow the neurological swelling to subside. The next 48 hours are critical. If she wakes, we will assess the paralysis. But for now, she is alive." Arthur exhaled a breath he felt he had been holding since the crash, leaning heavily against the beige hospital wall. "Can I see her?" "Briefly. ICU, room 4. Before Arthur could take a step toward the ward, the sharp, authoritative click of heels echoing on the linoleum made him turn. Approaching him was Beatrice Montgomery, Victoria's fiercely loyal general counsel. Beatrice was a formidable woman in her 60s, wearing a damp trench coat over a tailored suit, clutching a thick, leather-bound portfolio against her chest like a shield. "Arthur," Beatrice said, her voice tight with an emotion she was ruthlessly trying to suppress. She looked at his battered state, then toward the ICU doors. "Is she—" "She made it through surgery. She's in a coma," Arthur replied, his voice raspy. He looked at the portfolio in Beatrice's hands, a sudden instinctual dread washing over him. "Before she lost consciousness, Victoria told me something. She mentioned a private investigator. She mentioned my daughter." Beatrice's expression hardened, though her eyes betrayed a profound sorrow. She gestured toward a secluded alcove near the coffee machines. "She called me from the car, Arthur, 3 minutes before the truck hit you. She told me the truth about what her father did, and she instructed me to give you this file if anything happened to her. She didn't want you in the dark for another second." They sat in the dim alcove. Beatrice unclasped the portfolio and slid a dense stack of documents across the small, faux wood table. At the top was a dossier compiled by David Henson, a top-tier corporate investigator. Stamped in red ink across the medical records were the logos of Vanguard Fertility Clinic, a premier facility that Arthur and his late wife, Sarah, had used 8 years ago after a grueling, heartbreaking struggle with infertility. "Read the ownership structure, Arthur," Beatrice instructed quietly. Arthur's calloused fingers trembled as he flipped past the cover page. Vanguard Fertility Clinic was owned by a holding company. That holding company was a subsidiary of a massive biotech trust, and the sole signatory on that trust was Richard, Victoria's late tyrannical father. "I don't understand," Arthur whispered, the words tasting like ash. "Sarah and I used a donor egg. The clinic matched us with an anonymous donor. Sarah carried her. Sarah gave birth to Chloe. Richard despised you, Arthur," Beatrice said, her tone laced with absolute disgust for her former employer. "He thought you were a peasant who would dilute his bloodline. He broke you and Victoria apart using forged ledgers and fabricated engagement announcements. But a decade later, Victoria developed severe endometriosis. She had to undergo emergency surgery that compromised her fertility. Before the procedure, Richard secretly forced the doctors on his payroll, to harvest and freeze her viable eggs. He never told her. He told Victoria the extraction failed. Arthur's heart hammered against his bruised ribs. He stared at the documents, the cold, clinical print spelling out a horrific violation of human life. Richard was obsessed with his legacy, Beatrice continued, wiping a stray tear from her cheek. He realized Victoria was becoming too hardened, too closed off to ever marry or have a child. He feared his bloodline would die with her. When his private security detail notified him that you and your wife had walked into one of his clinics seeking a donor egg, Richard saw an opportunity. He orchestrated the swap. He had his own daughter's embryo implanted into your wife. He used us as incubators, Arthur choked out, the sheer, psychopathic magnitude of the betrayal crushing his lungs. He gave my wife a child, knowing it was his own granddaughter, just so he could observe, Beatrice finished grimly. His private journals, which the investigator unearthed, outlined his plan. He intended to let you and Sarah raise the child through her formative years, to give her a grounded, loving foundation that he knew he couldn't provide. Once the child was older, Richard planned to legally destroy you, reveal the biological truth, and take the child back, using his unlimited wealth and legal power. He wanted a perfect heir, but his heart gave out 2 years later, and the secret died with him. Arthur stared at the photograph attached to the file, a blown-up image of a microscopic embryo. His daughter, the little girl with the stubborn chin and the piercing dark eyes, the girl who loved painting and hated math. She was the biological daughter of the woman lying broken in the ICU. She was the living manifestation of the future Arthur and Victoria had dreamed of 20 years ago, twisted into existence by a dead man's malice. A raw, guttural sob tore itself from Arthur's throat. He buried his face in his hands, weeping not just for himself, but for Sarah, who had died believing a lie, and for Victoria, who had been stripped of her motherhood, her love, and her agency by the very man who was supposed to protect her. 3 agonizing weeks bled into one another. The corporate vultures did not wait for the blood to dry. While Victoria remained trapped in the silent darkness of her coma, the boardroom of her logistics empire became a battlefield. William Harper, the very man Richard had once tried to force Victoria to marry, was now a minority shareholder and a ruthless opportunist. Citing Victoria's prolonged incapacitation and the lack of a named successor, William initiated a hostile proxy vote to strip her of her CEO title and seize control of the board. Arthur rarely left Harborview. He ran his construction company from a laptop perched on a plastic tray table beside Victoria's bed, delegating tasks to his foreman, while the rhythmic hiss-click of the ventilator marked the passing hours. Every evening, his sister brought Chloe to the hospital. The 7-year-old would sit by the bed, drawing pictures of suns and houses, blissfully unaware that the battered, beautiful woman sleeping beneath the wires was her biological mother. On the 22nd day, the storm broke. Sunlight pierced the Seattle gloom, cutting a sharp golden swath across Victoria's hospital bed. Arthur was reading a soil density report when he heard a sound that made his blood freeze. It was a jagged, uneven intake of breath. The ventilator's rhythm hitched. Arthur dropped his laptop and rushed to her side. Victoria's eyelids fluttered, parting slightly to reveal the disorientation and terror swimming in her dark eyes. "Victoria," Arthur whispered, pressing the call button furiously. "Victoria, I'm here. You're safe. You're in the hospital." She blinked slowly, the harsh light overwhelming her. She tried to speak, but the intubation tube blocked her vocal cords. She weakly squeezed Arthur's hand. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, tears of pure, unadulterated relief spilling onto the pristine white sheets. The recovery was brutal. When the tube was removed, Victoria's first words were not about her company or her injuries, but a desperate, fractured plea to Arthur. "The file, did you read it?" "I know everything," Arthur had replied, stroking her hair. "We survived him, Victoria. Richard is dead. We are alive." A week after she regained consciousness, the doctors confirmed the spinal shock was receding. She would need months of grueling physical therapy, but she would walk again. However, the emotional paralysis was a heavier burden to lift. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, Arthur brought Chloe into the room. Victoria was sitting up, propped against a mountain of pillows. When the little girl walked in, wearing a bright yellow raincoat and carrying a construction paper card, the breath left Victoria's lungs entirely. She stared at the child. She saw her own cheekbones. She saw Arthur's gentle smile. It was looking into a mirror that reflected a timeline that had been stolen from her. "Hi," Chloe said shyly, holding out the card. "My dad said you got hurt in a big crash. I made you a get well card. It has a dinosaur on it." Tears streamed silently down Victoria's face. Her hands shook violently as she reached out to take the card. "It's beautiful, Chloe. Thank you. It's the most beautiful dinosaur I've ever seen." Arthur stood behind his daughter, his hand resting reassuringly on her shoulder. He met Victoria's eyes, offering a silent, unwavering promise. They would not overwhelm the child. They would take it slow, but they were a family, forged in the fires of unimaginable betrayal, and nothing would ever tear them apart again. But Victoria still had one demon left to slay. 2 days before the board vote that would oust her, William Harper arrived at Harborview Medical Center, flanked by a team of tailored lawyers. He walked into Victoria's VIP recovery suite with the smug confidence of a man who believed he had already won. "Victoria, darling," William practically purred, adjusting his silk tie. "It's a tragedy, truly. But the market demands stability. I've brought the severance and transition documents. Sign them, and you can focus entirely on your physical therapy. The company will be in safe hands." Victoria sat in her specialized wheelchair, dressed not in a hospital gown, but in a sharp, dark silk blouse brought by Beatrice. The Ice Queen had not melted. The ice had simply been refined into diamonds. "William," Victoria said, her voice a dangerous, velvet purr. She gestured to Beatrice, who was standing quietly in the corner. "Before I sign anything, I thought you might want to look at the financial audits Beatrice conducted on your shell companies in the Cayman Islands while I was incapacitated." William's smug smile faltered. Beatrice stepped forward, dropping a thick manila folder onto the rolling tray table. "Embezzlement, corporate espionage, and wire fraud, Mr. Harper," Beatrice stated coldly. "You've been siphoning capital from the European subsidiaries for 3 years." Victoria leaned forward, her eyes locked onto William with lethal precision. "I spent my entire life trying to be a ruthless monster because my father convinced me it was the only way to survive. I'm done being a monster. But I am still a predator, William, and you are trespassing on my territory." William's face drained of color. He looked at the folder, then back at Victoria. "You withdraw your proxy vote," Victoria commanded, her voice ringing with unquestionable authority. "You resign from the board by midnight. You surrender your shares at a 30% discount to market value. If you do this, I let you walk away to ruin your life somewhere else. If you refuse, Beatrice hands this folder to the Securities and Exchange Commission, and I personally guarantee you spend the next decade in federal prison." The silence in the room was absolute. William Harper, outmaneuvered and utterly destroyed, turned on his heel and walked out without a single word, his lawyers scrambling like frightened mice in his wake. Arthur, who had been watching from the doorway, let out a low whistle. "Remind me never to be in breach of contract with you again." Victoria looked at him, the lethal intensity fading, replaced by a soft, genuine exhaustion. "You're the only contract I ever wanted to honor, Arthur." 6 months later, the Seattle rain fell gently against the expansive windows of Arthur's refurbished suburban home. Victoria sat by the fireplace, a physical therapy cane resting against her chair. She was no longer the sole CEO. She had appointed a trusted president to run the day-to-day operations, choosing instead to serve as chairwoman. On the rug in front of her, Arthur and Chloe were attempting to build a structurally sound castle out of magnetic blocks. "You need a stronger foundation on the east quadrant, Dad," Chloe argued, pointing a tiny finger at the leaning tower, "or it's going to sink." Arthur laughed, a deep, resonant sound of pure joy. He looked up, catching Victoria's eye. "She sounds exactly like a certain stubborn executive I know." Victoria smiled, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of peace settle into her bones. The glass walls she had built around her heart for 20 years were gone, shattered on a rain-slicked intersection, leaving behind something infinitely stronger. She leaned down, picking up a magnetic block, and handed it to the daughter she had never known she lost, ready to finally build a future together. From a devastating wreck to the shocking revelation of a twisted family secret, Arthur and Victoria proved that the truth can shatter your world, only to help you rebuild a stronger one. Can love truly survive a 20-year lie and the ultimate betrayal? If this story left you speechless, hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a massive plot twist, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life dramatic stories.